Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to a new episode of Chatting with Lady C. Hello, Mum, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, honey. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you.
You're good?
Yeah.
Are you well as good?
I'm always well.
You're good.
I'm good.
Oh, damn. Like your shirt.
Thank you, yeah, it's my favourite.
It's lovely.
I know, I love it.
Jermyn Street?
Yeah, probably.
Very nice. So, do you have any goodies for me today?
Yes, so for our first question today is from Veronica Batum. Lady C, do you know the very interesting inhabitants of Longleat? Did you know the crazy Marquis of Bath who just passed away? This would make an amazing book, don't you think?
It is an amazing book. It's called Lord of Love. It's by Nestor Winellis. Maybe we can put up something about it afterwards. I know it's for sale on Amazon, in Kindle and etc. I've read the book. I know Nestor. You remember Nestor? We used to go and stay with Nestor in Paris on the way before we got the flat. Do you remember? We used to go and stay with Nestor.
Yes, I remember Nestor.
Yes. Well,
and she's published this book?
She wrote this book.
Oh, she wrote the book?
Yeah. She wrote it, and it's actually a very good book. And he led a very interesting life. I knew Alexander quite well. I stayed with him once or twice. He was very eccentric, very. But there was method in his madness because he was an absolutely brilliant businessman. He turned a fortune of tens of millions into hundreds of millions. He was really a very canny businessman. He died of COVID a few months ago. His wife, Anna, I've only met once or twice glancingly. She is Hungarian, and Lenka, his daughter, many years ago, she used to work in television, and she interviewed me for something. And sweet girl. Sulin, I met them when they were children. And they're a little bit older than you, but they're much younger than me, so we're not really in the same circle, so to speak. But I have a great deal of respect for him and his wife, Emma McQuiston, who's now the present Lady Bath, and very glamorous, very attractive, very comme il faut, absolutely perfectly presented as a current day lady should be. I can think of one or two people who could take a leaf out of her book and use her as an example. She is half Nigerian and half English, and Meghan Markle ought to go to the Marchioness of Bath's School of Good Behaviour. She really ought to. And Alexander was really very nice. He was a really nice man. But totally self-centered, totally egotistical. And he had these ghastly, he'd kill me if he heard me saying it, but he had these ghastly Kama Sutra paintings which he did. And when you went to stay at Longleat, he would proudly take you through these wonderful rooms, which, of course, fortunately, he wasn't allowed to paint over the existing fabric of the building. So he had to paint on wood, which was then put in front of. And as soon as Sulin took over from him, he stripped most of them out, which Alexander was furious about. But it showed that Sulin had rather better taste than his father. Alexander fancied himself a great painter, a great diarist. He was a great businessman, and he was a great eccentric. But I would not have said he was a great artist or a great diarist. But he wrote millions of words. I mean, just amazing man, amazing. Yes, I did know him. I knew him. I stayed there. I used to go to his parties. He used to come to my parties. He was a good egg. He was a good egg. And one or two of my friends were his queens. No, they didn't call them queens. That's rastas. Rastas. Bob Marley had queens. Alexander had wifelets. And one of them was an old friend of mine called Tara Moon, who's a very beautiful Trinidadian Chinese, really beautiful. I mean, I've known Tara for 50 years. Really beautiful woman. And she was one of Alexander's wifelets, and one or two others, Trudy, Juggernaut, Karma. I can't remember them all offhand now, but I knew one or two of them. They were really sweet, you know. Do you remember Shenda telling us about a dinner when she had Alexander and two of the wifelets for dinner with the Russian ambassador and the Russian ambassador's wives? And they started to fight. The wifelets literally started to fight in the middle of dinner. And I think she had the Russian ambassador, and I think she had somebody like the American ambassador or something. The whole thing collapsed into a melee of jealousy. And all of that and stuff like that is in Lord of Love. I mean, he had the most chaotic personal life. Chaotic, you know. Something like 70-something wifelets. But he was also, it has to be said, I mean, I'm going to be really naughty now. He was very hospitable, but the wine did not flow freely, nor was it ever good quality wine. Fortunately, I don't drink wine, but everybody used to complain about the fact that when you stayed at Longleat, you really better bring your bottle of wine. Otherwise, you were going to be given something completely unspeakable and undrinkable, which, of course, kept the bills down as well, because if you were served utter rubbish, you never wanted a second glass. I'm being very naughty. You'd better move me on to the next question before I completely disgrace myself. Don't you think?
Not for you. So for our next question today is from Tamara Rutland Mills. As an American, I am having trouble understanding why the Duke of a certain place does not seem to have any connections or responsibility to that place. To illustrate, the Duke of Sussex acts like he couldn't care less about Sussex. I just don't get it. It seems to be a great honour in which the bearer should have a responsibility to uphold, represent and look after the people there.
Well, that's, of course, I think, a really good question, because in her innocence, she has actually asked really, what is the purpose of a duke? And to understand what a duke is, you need to understand what a duke was. There were two ancient Roman titles, duke and count, and they were warriors. As the ancient Roman Empire collapsed, counts and dukes became hereditary titles. Duke is higher than count, normally. Under the French monarchy, the sons of the king or the brothers of the king would often be, if not dukes, counts. For instance, Louis XVI's two brothers were the Count of Provence and the Count of Artois. But Louis XIV's brother was the Duke of Orleans. A duke and a count used to be in medieval times and shortly after medieval times almost rulers of little fiefs. And gradually the title became aristocratic. In England, for instance, it started to become aristocratic under the Plantagenets, when you had the Duke of Norfolk. But by and large, dukes were often royal, and then they became aristocratic. Now, there is actually a big connection between the duke and the place that he is a duke of. There used to be, not necessarily where the royal titles are concerned, but where the aristocratic titles are concerned. For instance, the present Duke of Argyll lives in Argyll. The Duke of Northumberland lives in Northumberland. They play big roles locally. Then you have other dukes. These are really relatively ancient titles, because before the Dukes of Argyll were dukes, they were earls and marquises of Argyll, and they were the chief, they still are the chief of the Clan Campbell, which always was the most important clan in Scotland. And so, being the earls, then the marquises, then the Dukes of Argyll, their land was Argyll, and they still own, I suspect, over 100,000 acres in Argyllshire. The Percys, who are an even more ancient dukedom than the Campbells, are Northumberland, the Dukes of Northumberland. They again used to be the Earls of Northumberland, because before they became the Dukes of Northumberland. The Duke of Norfolk, which is the most ancient non-royal English dukedom, he lives 5 miles down the road from us. He lives in Arundel. So he doesn't live in Norfolk, but the title is Duke of Norfolk, and the Dukes of Norfolk used to have a lot of land in Norfolk and play a huge part in Norfolk. But he is still the premier aristocrat of this country. He is the Earl Marshal. By hereditary right, he does all state funerals, weddings, etc. So these are people whose connections to their territories have, to an extent, remained intact. I mean, I don't know to what extent the Norfolks now have land in Norfolk, because, of course, their estates are really down here in Sussex. But certainly Argyll and Northumberland and others of that nature. There are very few dukes, non-royal dukes. I think it used to be 26. I suppose it's most likely about 24 now. And they take their roles very seriously, and they take their responsibilities seriously, and they have a lot of responsibilities that they have to live up to. They are like mini sovereigns in their own territories. And I remember when Princess Louise, Queen Victoria's daughter, was going to marry the Duke of Argyll, but he wasn't yet the Duke, but he was going to be the Duke of Argyll. He was at the time the Marquis of Lorne. And she balked at the fact that, she was not marrying a royal Duke to be. She was going to marry a non-royal Duke to be. Queen Victoria said to her, "Don't be a silly girl. The Dukes of Argyll are as much monarchs in their own territory as I am in Britain." And put Princess Louise very firmly in her place. And they do take it seriously, as they ought to. Harry does not take it seriously. It's obvious he doesn't take it seriously. He has no real connection to Sussex, but then royal dukedoms often have no connection to the place. There are very few royal dukes. And there are very few royal dukedoms. There's the royal dukedom of Gloucester, Kent, Sussex. I'm just trying to think what others. Cumberland, Albany. There are a few, but they're not that many. And they were once very important, connected to the land of their dukedom. That has ceased to be over the centuries, but they still are supposed to have a huge connection to the whole of the land of this country, not just to the territory whence their title originates. And this is the sticking point with Harry and with Meghan, that they have displayed no attachment to Britain or to the British people or to British territory, that their attachment seems to have been wholly to increasing their bank account so that she can become a billionairess. And I think that answers the question. Do you think it answers the question?
I think you got many points out there.
You did? Okay, good. Okay, honey, great. Next question?
No worries. So for our next question today is from Maria Williams. Not sure how I ask questions, but I'd really like to know what Lady C thinks of Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard's.
Well, I think I already did
Yes.
Something on this while the trial was taking place. Mr. Justice Nicholl, who I gather is a perfectly sound and sensible judge, found in favour of Amber Heard. I was astonished. I know of very few people who were not astonished. Of course, it's always difficult if you are reading about a case as opposed to actually being in the court. but the reportage was sufficiently widespread and penetrating, I think, for most people to come to the conclusion that they believed one or the other. And I have to say, with all due respect to Mr. Justice Nicol, I believed Johnny Depp.
Mm.
He chose to believe Amber Heard. I chose to believe Johnny Depp. I think, in a nutshell, that's it. It's who you believe. I thought that of what I was reading and of my own knowledge of rather troubled people, that his version of events resonated with me and rang my truth bell in a way that hers didn't. So, but that's just my personal opinion. What do you think?
I agree with you. Of what he said compared to her, it sounded more likely that he was saying the truth than she did.
Mm.
And to be honest, like, we have to stop always believing that it's going to be the man that's going to be the bad one. He could also be a victim.
That's
like,
right.
I look at a lot of this TV show called Couples Dining with Me, and stuff like that, and they always ask the same questions. Oh, who do you think's more dominant in the relationship? And 90%, it's actually the women that are more dominant in the relationship. So take that figures on account, and it's the ladies that are saying it. She's like, yeah, I'm the boss, I don't care, I tell him to do that, he goes and do it. And it's funny because you'd find out that actually women are more dominant in a relationship, even if the man says it to him, because the man is just trying to please the person, I think. But that's what makes it dominant.
I think often that's true. I mean, I have seen sufficient relationships in my time to know that women within the family unit usually, and have always had, far more power than the average man in the relationship. It's as if a man who he struggles in the world at large, he comes home, he wants his wife to do everything. And
it's the opposite.
Sort of thing. That, it's the family's her province. In the olden days, it's not the same now, of course, because everybody works.
And everything's changed as well. And a lot of couples nowadays, I do have to say, like sharing. Like the chores and jobs and cooking and cleaning, they all share it nowadays, compared to before. You'd automatically think that the lady had to do everything in the relationship, but nowadays, well, more my generation, I would say it's a lot of sharing.
Yes, well, of course, I'm the generation where men did absolutely nothing, and women did it. Well, servants usually did everything. It's got to be said, not the women, but the women were the ones who were responsible for everything running smoothly. So, next question, honey.
No worries. So for our final question today is from Deputy Dave. I would like to ask Lady C about the Romanovs, specifically when the Tsar Nicholas II asked for asylum in England. Why did his cousin George V refuse the request?
Well, in fact, George V did not initially refuse the request. It depends who you believe and what you believe. The papers are very clear. The British government was approached to provide asylum for the Tsar, the Tsarina, and the children. Lloyd George agreed. And there are various versions as to what happened next. But it is interesting that for the remainder of his life, George V always referred to Lloyd George as that murderer. Because in fact, Lloyd George was completely innocent in the whole thing. One version of it, one interpretation of what happened is that Lord Stamfordham, who was the private secretary, recommended to George V that the Tsar's presence would have been a destabilizing factor in the country. That is one interpretation of what made George V change his mind, because George V is the person who changed his mind, not Lloyd George, not the British government. There is another version of events told within the old circles of the old branches of the royal families, that Queen Mary is the one who discouraged George V, and that her reason for doing it was that when she was a girl growing up, and Queen Mary's parents, the Duke and Duchess of Teck, were very rackety members of, well, she was a rackety member of the British royal family, and he was a morganatic member, not even of the British royal family, because he was not royal. He was a morganatic of a morganatic union, and that when they were growing up, Queen Mary and her Teck siblings were treated very much as second-class citizens in royal circles. They were what was known as par-royal as opposed to actual royal. And Queen Mary evidently never forgave Alex, who was the last Tsarina, for when they used to be staying together, Alex would rub her nose in it that she was not royal. And there had also been an incident when the Tsar, the Tsarina, and the girls, and Alexei the Tsarevich came to Britain. They actually didn't land in England. I think, if I remember correctly, they stayed on their yacht, the Standard, and they were at Cowes and around Cowes. But at some point, if I remember correctly, the girls came on shore and their shoes got ruined by the wet grass, and Empress Alexandra made such a fuss about this, and Queen Mary also never forgave her for that. How true it is, whether this was truly her motive, and whether she could have been petty enough, and people can be petty, you know, it's sort of, well, you always thought you were so great and grand. Well, darling, look who's great and grand now. No. And of course, neither Queen Mary nor George V ever imagined that the Tsar, the Tsarina, and the children would be slaughtered the way they were. So there was a certain amount of rewriting of history by George V. And he always blamed Lloyd George, but I think had Stamfordham really been behind it, he wouldn't have blamed Lloyd George. I think the fact that Queen Mary was behind it, and that Queen Mary, on such petty grounds, had convinced him to withdraw consent, and then, of course, to use the more acceptable grounds, because everybody covers dirty deeds with noble motives. I mean, it's par for the course. So, of course, George V wasn't going to say to Lord Stamfordham, well, actually, I've decided, Stamfordham, that, I'm going to change my mind because May thinks that Alex is a nightmare and, let her take her lousy, rancid self somewhere else and make a nuisance of herself with someone else, because nobody liked the Empress Alexandra. In all the family papers and the family diaries, they all absolutely couldn't stand her. She was a carping, complaining, neurotic, controlling megalomaniac. She was she was a living nightmare. She was obviously very disturbed on some level. But sanctimonious to the nth degree with it, about so religious and she was much better than everybody else, and she was always ill, and her feelings were more delicate than anybody else's, and I think that, to me, the most credible thing is that what is said amongst the old royal families was right, which was that Queen Mary discouraged George V for purely petty reasons. And when it all went so terribly wrong, he had to blame someone. He couldn't blame his wife. He certainly wasn't going to blame himself. He didn't dare blame Lord Stamfordham because he needed Lord Stamfordham, and Lord Stamfordham would have known that he had not discouraged King George V from giving asylum. And so he blamed Lloyd George. And I think that's what happened. Of course, most of the papers are still not open for public inspection. And who knows, might never be, they can keep them locked away forever if they choose to. What do you think? Does that sound interesting?
It does. Like you said, there's probably many versions of it, but hearing your one is always more interesting.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I just think, that people don't always appreciate that their petty little actions are going to have terrible consequences. Mm. And I can well see Queen Mary thinking, this woman has been a pill all my life. She made my life a misery when we were children. She made my life a misery when they came to stay in whatever year it was, 1909, 19 whatever. And she thought, I just can't bear having her around. No, no, no. And as simple as that. And on that note, I hope that has been of interest to you. Thank you very much. I hope you have enjoyed this. Do keep the questions coming in, and I look forward to seeing you in our next video.
Well, thank you everybody, and we hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please hit the like button, subscribe and share with your friends. Thank you very much, and goodbye.